Hello, everyone. How are
Hi.
we this evening? Good to see you all. And let's see, any questions? Good. I have been reading your papers. So far, I've been enjoying them. I mean, I will be sending them back with comments as I read them. And someone did ask about citations. So let me just say I prefer the Chicago style, which is footnotes. I have a long rant that I can go on about why I don't like the Modern Language Association, which foisted the whole let's put things in parentheses in the middle of a sentence idea on us. Suffice it to say, I prefer footnotes. If you're just using one source, it's okay just to put the page number in parentheses. And those of you using primary sources, I've been impressed with what you found and what you're doing with them so far. And, footnote that tells you the author, the date, and where you can find it. I'll give, well, maybe I should give more detailed instructions on this since it's usually in history, you cite anything that is in quotes. And that's one case where you always need a footnote when you're quoting something. If you are citing, and by the way, generally, you only should be citing primary sources. I mean, quoting primary sources. Don't quote something some historian has written somewhere because chances are you can say it better. And I'd rather have it your voice than someone else's. If it's some idea you got from some historian there, then say according to so-and-so, or give the idea and then cite it if it's some critical idea you're using, but you don't need to and there's some things, and again, you're a pretty sophisticated group. Some things you're not going to need a footnote for, like, for example, the Declaration of Independence was adopted on July 4th, 1776. That's kind of a commonplace idea that we know. If you're citing something like the Declaration of Independence, just cite it as the Declaration of Independence. Don't cite whatever book you found it in. Similarly with the Constitution, and similarly with the Bible. I guess those are the things you don't need to cite well, if you're doing some kind of biblical exegesis, then yeah, it does make a difference which version you're using. But just, just cite the chapter and verse. Okay, I'm kind of getting off the subject of the revolution now. And so cite things, don't, so far in this class, I haven't found people relying on, say, Googling something or Wikipedia or history.com. Those are useful if you just want to get kind of a quick background thing, but in terms of doing a research paper, no, that's not what you're going to be citing. So I know I'm throwing out a lot of ideas here. Someone asked a very simple question about citations, and now I'm starting on a rant. And I need, the dean has advised me to stop ranting because she said apparently she still has faith that there are things I can teach you in the moments between these wild rants about things. So I apologize. And if you see the dean, tell her that I am really reining it in. So, okay. So that's that, as I said, reading your papers, and yeah, we'll talk more about the upcoming assignments when the time comes. Next week, probably, if I have any further ideas on great assignments for you that I'm sorry I didn't think about when I was putting the syllabus together, I'll send you an email or tweet like 4 a.m. with some idea I've just had that, you've got to start on immediately. Okay. Good. So where did we leave off last time?
We were talking about the crossing of the Delaware.
We're talking about the crossing of the Delaware. Okay, that was good. Yeah. Anything else anyone remember, or are you satisfied with that whole expedition?
Kind of like the Battle of New York and like
Okay,
the
so you
retreat
talked
to
about the Battle
Manhattan.
of New York. Yeah. For some reason, my volume is way down. Let me turn it up so I can hear you. Yeah, the Battle of New York, which then leads to Washington being chased across New Jersey, and then the Delaware campaign. Anything else anyone remember that was notable or interesting? Okay, so let's see. You know, what had happened was the British had pretty much taken, yeah, as I said, they chased Washington across New Jersey. And in fact, New Jersey has this route marked, the Washington Retreat route. And here's a point of interest for you that New Jersey is putting several $1 million a year over the next 6 years into efforts to shore up her Revolutionary War infrastructure, which is quite a remarkable commitment. We are still working on the Massachusetts legislature to establish a commission to commemorate the 250th anniversaries of the Revolution. New York has just introduced legislation to do this, and Orange County and Westchester County, New York, both have great funding for Revolutionary War reenactments and commemorations in those places. Getting the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to move on this has been kind of an undertaking that this is another rant I will have about how difficult this has been. So if you want to contact the dean told me not to lobby you to contact your representatives or senators for various things. So you did not hear from me that there's a bill pending, and a bill actually in the Rules Committee of the Senate. And I think it is Senate Bill 1852 to establish a 250th commission. So that's it's been in the works for a while, but that's that. The dean has said that if I start lobbying, I have to tell each of you to lobby for your favorite pet cause, and then we wouldn't get to what's actually happening in the revolution. And as I said, Washington chased across New Jersey, and then the day after Christmas, the morning of December 26th, surprises the Hessians who have been left in these posts in New Jersey. The British aren't going to spend the winter in New Jersey. They're going to go back to New York. And with the revolution seeming to be ending, some of them are actually getting on ships to sail back to England. One of them is Lord Cornwallis. By the way, here is one myth that you may know, and you're doubtless going to hear it whenever anyone discusses Washington crossing the Delaware. And that is the Hessians were drunk, which is not true. Okay, so the Hessians were actually very good soldiers. They were not drunk the morning after Christmas. There is, well, you'll be reading, or you should be reading, David Hackett Fisher's book, Washington's Crossing, which has great detail on this. And one story is why Major Denop was not in Trenton when he should have been. He had several hundred men, and Major Denop had gone south to Mount Holly, another town in New Jersey, a few days before Christmas. And there he took up headquarters in the home of apparently a charming widow named Elizabeth Ross, and widow of a doctor. And he had such a good time staying in her comfortable home, he didn't want to go back to Trenton. So he stayed there over Christmas, and hence Major Denop was not at Trenton. Instead, he was in Mount Holly, New Jersey, with the vivacious widow Ross. Fisher speculates maybe this was Betsy Ross, but actually it wasn't. Betsy Ross, real person. She was actually an upholsteress, had a successful upholstery business. I think I've already mentioned this. And Marla Miller at UMass Amherst has written a really good biography of Betsy Ross. Anyway, but leave you with that. Major Denop at Mount Holly and Washington. Actually, I do have a map showing you how this campaign worked out. Okay, so as I said, Washington had planned to have 3 prongs crossing the Delaware. One where he was, one a little closer to Trenton, and then one south of Trenton, but his was the only one that made it. And in his regiment, you see he has Nathaniel Greene, John Sullivan, and they actually had divided north of town to have these separate, and the idea is Sullivan will go to the south of the town to prevent the Hessians from escaping that way. Greene and Washington will go to the north of the town. Henry Knox will place the artillery at crucial positions to give control of the town. And the amazing thing is, this is an era, they have no cell phones, other kinds of communication. They simply had synchronized their watches. Some men would carry a pocket watch and did that. And as Washington and his forces are beginning to exchange fire here with the Germans, they can hear Sullivan and his men exchanging fire down here. So they know that had worked, that they're able to surround the Hessians in Trenton. And Colonel Rall is the head of the forces here, and he is awakened, and he actually is mortally wounded in the fighting. And thus, and so he surrenders, and Kniphausen, another of the colonels, surrenders, realizing they're surrounded. So all in all, Washington captures about 1,000 prisoners. 22 of the Hessians were killed, another 98 wounded, and 500 escaped. Now, Washington had wanted then to continue on to Princeton. Here you can see is the Princeton Road. And he thought they could really surprise the German forces at Princeton, which is not that far away. But by this time, his men were pretty much exhausted. And so instead, they all retreated across the river. They also feared what might happen if the Hessians, like Denop's regiment down here, the guys in Princeton, heard of the firing here, they might counterattack. Plus 500 or so Hessians had simply disappeared. So they're carrying the word that there's been this battle. So Washington doesn't want to risk having them attack. And plus, not only does he have to get his men across the river, he has to get 1,000 or so of the prisoners across the river. And this raises a question, what do you do with 1,000 prisoners if you're Washington's army, which only has about 3,000 men? And what he does, this is really a different period. What would happen if you were captured is you would be either held as a prisoner, if that were possible, and the British now have warships in New York Harbor they're going to use as prisons, or you will be paroled. And so the German officers and their men are paroled and sent south. So they're told to march south to Maryland and Virginia and not to take up arms again during the war. That's the parole. Okay, so you've been captured and now you won't fight again. So the parole will operate until you are exchanged. So it's really it is very much a gentlemanly thing. That is, you're going to trust this person not to break his parole. And so these guys do go south, and many of them stay, actually. Another strategy the Americans have been employing, this idea, I believe, was Benjamin Franklin's. Franklin had been a printer. He had printed up cards in German. And Franklin, by the way, did print a German newspaper in Philadelphia before he retired from printing in the 1740s. And Franklin also worried that German might become the language. I don't think it was a serious worry, but huge German immigration in the mid-18th century. And thus it's not unusual to have a printing press in Philadelphia able to print things in German, or have printers who are able to print in German. And these little tobacco cards are encouraging the German soldiers who are going into shops in New York to purchase tobacco to desert, and that they'll be given land. So this is, there's really little incentive for these guys to go back to Germany. And in fact, their prince in Germany will get paid if they die, but not if they go back. So there's not an incentive for him to have them go back either. So anyway, I'm getting off the subject here of Washington, going back across the Delaware. And meanwhile, in New York, Lord Cornwallis, who had been aboard a ship, ready, this is actually Washington accepting the surrender of Colonel Rall in Trenton. This is another painting by John Trumbull. And Trumbull, artist from Connecticut, his father was the governor of Connecticut. He served in Washington's army, and then after the war, he did a series of these paintings of different important scenes of the war. We saw one the other day. It's his painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That is one of the features in the rotunda of the United States Capitol. So on a ship in New York waiting to go back to England was Lord Cornwallis. And now Cornwallis, waning days of December 1776, hears about Washington's attack at Trenton. And so Cornwallis mobilizes, and he brings 5,500 regular troops across New Jersey to capture Washington and put an end to this nonsense once and for all. And Washington, by the way, had also come back to Trenton and had dug in at Trenton, preparing for this British assault. So Washington now is fortified south of the town, not wanting to give up New Jersey entirely. And Cornwallis is coming back by way of Princeton. See, it's quite a large force he is bringing. Here he has 5,000 men here. There's another 1,000 in Princeton. Our friend Major Leslie of Leslie's Retreat in Salem is here halfway between Princeton and Trenton with 1,000 men. And Washington and his 3,000 are here on the southern side of Trenton on the shores of Assunpink Creek, which is one of these streams flowing into the Delaware. And, if you're Washington, you pretty much know this is a bad situation. You have almost twice as many men coming at you as you have. And this is one of these, critical moments. And Cornwallis has very effectively and very quickly brought his men across New Jersey to the shores of the Delaware. And they arrive as Washington and his men have been digging in. And in Fisher's book, he has a very good account of the council of war in Cornwallis's camp and in Washington's camp. One of the things you'll see in Fisher's book, and I should ask if anyone's been reading the book, and rather than giving away the plot to you, has anyone been reading Fisher's Washington's Crossing? You're looking at me as though I've landed from another planet, asking about a strange medium you're not familiar with, the book. I apologize. Okay, so Fisher's Washington's Crossing gives a good account of these councils of war that each of the commanders had. Now, in Cornwallis's council of war, one issue that comes up is a number of his officers say, it's late afternoon now of January 2nd. Why don't we attack now? And Cornwallis doesn't think they should, because he knows how outnumbered Washington is. And one thing you see in this council of war, everyone in the council of war refers to Cornwallis as milord, because he is a lord. And that, of course, puts them all on a different level. He refers to them by their nicknames. So imagine you're calling someone milord and he's calling you Wooly or something. I mean, it gives a different credence. It's why you call me professor and I make up a nickname for you. It gives us this air of difference. So James, you remember to tell the dean, don't tell the dean that one. So, okay. So Cornwallis says, no reason to. And in fact, one of the famous lines of the war, one of the most famous lines of the war is Cornwallis says, "We have the old fox trapped. We'll bag him tomorrow." Still thinking of this in terms of fox hunting. And of course, Cornwallis, English aristocrat, knew fox hunting. They mocked Washington for thinking he knew something about fox hunting. And if this, by the way, were an English novel now, there would be a long digression as I discuss fox hunting, a story of the fox hunt, but that's what they think they're on. And Washington, the old fox, but they've got him trapped. There's no place he can go. He is really trapped there on the shores of this little creek in New Jersey, and the rebellion's going to end the next day when Cornwallis and his 5,000 men bag the old fox. And so that's what they are counting on. At Washington's council of war is somewhat different. as Washington is the commander-in-chief, but he has learned to rely on the other officers for advice. And often during the siege of Boston, you may remember, he kept pushing for an attack and the officers kept talking him out of it. He recognizes he can't fight the war alone. He does rely on these guys to fight the war. And one thing you see is Washington's superb skills as a manager, as a political general. And they're not certainly calling him Lord, they're calling him General. And one fact comes up because one of the junior officers had been doing some scouting and also talked to various people in town. And they, of course, had all come into Trenton along this road. And there is a very small, and at this point, ice-covered road this way. And one of the officers brings this idea that we could actually leave Trenton by this road and attack the rear of the British line at Princeton. And this is actually a brilliant idea. It's a road the British didn't know about, for one thing, and it's on one of the roads you'd only know about if you're a local. And here they bring in a farmer who says, oh yeah, there's this back road to Princeton. And so what Washington then does is, he has about 3,000 men. He has a few hundred of them stay in Trenton, building their fires, making as much noise they can, digging in, so that Cornwallis in his camp is going to hear the sound of these men fortifying. And Cornwallis thinks, isn't that quaint of them? Because they're going to get annihilated the next day, but still they're digging in. And meanwhile, Washington and his forces are taking this ice-covered road this way, doing it under complete silence. They don't want to give away that this 2,500 men are on the march to Princeton. And so the next morning, as Cornwallis is preparing his assault here at Trenton, suddenly they hear the sound of firing up here 10 miles to their rear in Princeton. And what happened was American forces started coming out of this wooded area here and ran into a British force there. Neither one knew the other was going to be there. And this is one of those critical moments as initially these American forces, surprised to have this British rear, and the British rear mobilizes and they start a fight here, and the Americans start to pull back. And then Washington comes on the scene, and Washington leads, he's on his horse, and he leads a charge against this British force. One of the soldiers from Connecticut reported he closed his eyes because he did not want to see Washington fall. But Washington doesn't. And Knox has brought the cannon, and the cannon actually are fired. The British are holding Nassau Hall, which is the building at Princeton, the college, what then called the college, well, it might have been called Princeton, then the College of New Jersey. They actually fire a cannon shot through Nassau Hall. I'm told it decapitated the portrait of King George III, but that might just be an apocryphal story. But you can see that there's a real battle going on in Princeton between Washington's forces and the rear of the British Army. And Cornwallis realizes that the real fighting is back this way. So he has to turn his army around to get back to Princeton now. He doesn't know there's this other road he could have followed Washington on. This is, for Cornwallis, this is a baffling moment. And so he begins, and his forces do begin their pursuit of Washington to Princeton. And Washington is able to stay just ahead of the British Army until they get to the center of New Jersey. And then Washington, there's some thought that Washington has, maybe we could continue on to New Brunswick and attack the British supply base there. That would be a great coup to attack their British supply base. Remember, but by this time, it's now the 4th or 5th of January. His men have been on the move for a couple of days, preparing for battle, engaging in battle, marching. and he knows that they are pretty much exhausted. The good news is, so is Cornwallis's army as they're pursuing Washington across New Jersey. So Washington turns north, and the town of Morristown, New Jersey, is in a hilly area, and he knows it would be of somewhat difficult access for the British, whose main intention now, because they don't know where else Washington is going to hit them. They now are on the 100 miles from New Brunswick, which is their base, and they need to get back to their base. They need to protect their base in case Washington attacks it. Washington, meanwhile, is taken off to Morristown, which is going to become his base. Cornwallis moves to New Brunswick, which will be their supply base. Then, of course, Cornwallis goes back to New York. But this essentially gives Washington control of New Jersey. And by the way, when Washington and Cornwallis next meet, it will be, they didn't really meet at this time, will be at Yorktown. And after the surrender at Yorktown, the officer corps in each army gets together for dinner, and there are toasts. And Cornwallis toasts Washington, saying that history will record your victory, your deeds on the Chesapeake, but she will say more about your deeds on the Delaware. You know, Cornwallis has a sense that this is a different kind of adversary he is fighting. There's another very important point I was going to make here, but it's temporarily slipped my mind about, oh yeah, here's another point to this. Now, one of the reasons the British had wanted to hold New Jersey was most of the population of New Jersey was loyal. And, you know, the governor, William Franklin, had kept New Jersey from becoming one of these hotbeds of sedition, as you saw in New England or in Virginia. By this time, William Franklin has been arrested, but you still have a population in New Jersey that really doesn't want to take sides. They're kind of happy with the way things are. And I read you the other day in Thomas Paine's Common Sense about the Tory who said, "Let me have peace in my day." And that was very much an attitude at the time. But what happens with the Hessian occupation of New Jersey, and by the way, if any of you have ancestry in Hesse, I'm not criticizing Hessians as a group for this. Remember, they come to this country knowing they're here to put down a peasant rebellion, and thus they think anything they can take is pretty much fair game. And so the loyal people of New Jersey think, okay, the Germans, these guys are here to protect us from the bad guys, the Continental Army. But what these guys do is steal everything they can. And when Washington does take Trenton, he finds wagon loads of stuff that was being prepared to be shipped back to Germany. Grandfather clocks, silver, all kinds of things. And so Washington posts ads that anyone missing any objects can collect them at Trenton. Now, Washington is not going to have his soldiers doing the same kind of looting that the Hessians are. Also, I should have to report, the Hessians do commit a lot of rapes and other atrocities against civilians in New Jersey, doing everything that is going to turn a loyal population against them. So in the fall of 1776, when the British and the Germans had marched across New Jersey, it was with the support of many of the people of New Jersey. Now, when the British Army is being chased across New Jersey, it's without the support of the civilian population, which has really turned on them very quickly. And Washington senses this, that he cannot lose the support of the people of these places where he's fighting. And that's a sense that Cornwallis has difficulty in matching. And this is going to be a persistent problem throughout the war for the British and their allies. Not that the Americans never did a bad thing, but there's another question here about why these guys are fighting. I mentioned that there are about 3,000 guys left in this camp. And that's one of these big questions historians have been asking. And as you've probably noticed and you're looking into this, how difficult it is to get the perspective of the ordinary person, which is why we really glom on to the few diaries and letters and things we have that give the ordinary person's perspective on this. And it's, by the way, it's a question people have had since at least 1776. What motivates these guys? At the end of the war, at Yorktown, there is a group of soldiers standing around. There's a German soldier who had been fighting with the British, a French soldier who had been fighting with the Americans. And now that there's peace, now that there's a truce, they're talking. And the German says, I fight for my master, you fight for your master. But who do these people fight for? And that is, I think, a big question. And actually, Peter Oliver, the former Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Superior Court, writes a history of the Revolution in about 1778. He writes it in London, and he's writing about the beginnings of the Revolution. And he reports being on the ship leaving Boston in March of 1776. And there was an American soldier. And so Oliver wanted to know why this guy was fighting against the crown. And this guy, who is apparently from, this guy had been captured at Bunker Hill. And he says, I lived in a country town. I was a shoemaker. I got my living by my labor. When the rebellion came on, I saw some of my neighbors get into commission who were no better than myself. I was very ambitious, did not like to see those men above me. I was asked to enlist as a private soldier, but he said my ambition was too great for such a low rank. I offered to enlist on having a lieutenant's commission, which was granted. Now, he says, I imagined myself in a way of promotion, and if I was killed in battle, that would be an end of me. But if my captain was killed, I'd rise in rank and then have a chance to rise higher. These were my only motives in entering the service. As to the dispute between Britain and the colonies, I know nothing of it. Neither am I capable of judging whether it is right or wrong. So you read Oliver's account of this guy. You know, he's a shoemaker in some town in New Hampshire, sees other people getting officers' commissions, dressing in fancy uniforms, and he thinks, well, why not me? And so he enlists as a lieutenant, thinking if my captain gets killed, then I can become a captain. So it's simply a way for someone to get ahead. And there is an element of that in some of this military service. And that's a question we'll have till the end of the war, because people still turn out to fight, even when it doesn't seem like things are going well. But there's an historian named John Shai who has written a lot about the common soldier in the Revolution. And so he was kind of interested in who this guy was, because here you have someone explaining why he got into the service. And according to Shai, you know, he found, okay, town in New Hampshire, and here is a guy who enlists as a lieutenant, captured at Bunker Hill. So he's able to narrow down who this might be. And he found out there's a guy named Lieutenant William Scott from Peterborough, New Hampshire. Okay, you can find out the unit that was Bunker Hill, officers captured, and this helps narrow it down. And Lieutenant Scott had a cousin who was also named William Scott. And to tell them apart, the lieutenant is generally called Long Bill Scott, and the other one is called Short Bill. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest one of them was tall and one was short. Although sometimes people in New England like to do those nicknames, it's the opposite. So you may know someone named Tiny, or some other name, a term of endearment for someone. I don't know if that's a particularly New England thing, or just I hang out with the wrong kind of people who make mean, taunting nicknames about each other. You know, I'm just talking about the history department now. Anyway, so Long Bill, let me see, now I think I'm getting them mixed up. Okay, Short Bill, the captain in the regiment, is actually Long Bill's superior officer. So here, Long Bill is telling Oliver, if my captain gets killed, then I'll become the captain. Well, the captain's his cousin, which says something. And he kept a store and raises a regiment. And then, as I said, he's captured. And so he spends the next year, that is Long Bill, the guy whose story I've just told you, spends a year in Halifax. Then he escapes. He finds a boat, gets out of Halifax, And you would think, I don't know, if I were Long Bill, that probably would have been the end of my military service. I would have felt like I've done enough, since my ambition was to become an officer, get ahead, and that didn't seem to work out. But that's not what happens. Instead, he goes to New York and joins Washington's army during the battles around New York. In fact, he is at Fort Washington when it is captured. Imagine that. In June of the previous year, he'd been captured at Bunker Hill. He's been held as a prisoner until March of 1776 by the British. And then he's sent as a prisoner up to Halifax, and then comes back, joins Washington's army. He's at Fort Washington when it falls, and he escapes by diving into the Hudson River and swimming across. He has a sword which he ties around his neck, and his watch, doesn't want to get his watch wet, so he pins that to his hat and escapes. And then he goes back to New Hampshire. And instead of this time deciding, hey, I'm going to sit this out, he goes back to New Hampshire and he recruits a new company, including 2 of his sons. And they serve for the duration of the war. And they're part of the defenses of Boston, again, and also the defenses against Burgoyne's army. And he also takes part in fighting in Rhode Island. And then in 1781, he's ordered south to Virginia. His health breaks down and he's allowed now to resign. So here's a guy who said, I only joined because I wanted to get ahead. And he winds up spending 5 years in the service. And again, this is an anecdote. We really can't draw much from this other than, well, it's an interesting anecdote. And it does require a lot of looking to figure out who these guys are and why they are fighting. Okay, so let's see, getting back, if we can, to New Jersey, another thing happens here, which is very important. And that is this. As I said, Washington is holding the, I think I have a better map of New Jersey here. Okay, this is Washington. This is another, actually, no, this is the Philadelphia painter, Charles Wilson Peale. And this, I believe this is Peale, Washington at Princeton. And here he is, hand on a cannon, and the men in the background, this is Nassau, the principal college building at Princeton. And here you can see British flag on the ground as Washington now has taken Princeton and has time to rest or lean on a cannon while Peale paints his portrait. Okay, yeah, that's a little later than this. So let me just tell you what happens in New Jersey while Washington is holding Morristown. The British still rely on New Jersey to provision their forces in New York. And, you know, New Jersey, do we know New Jersey's nickname?
Garden State?
Thank you, Lizette. It is the Garden State because of the farmland of New Jersey. And the, so in the, you know, this is after January of 1777, with Washington now occupying Morristown. And by the way, you can find online a database that tells you every place where Washington stayed during the course of the Revolution. I'll send you a link to this because he does spend quite a bit of time in Morristown, which is now actually, there's actually a national park in Morristown. Anyway, the British are sending foraging parties into New Jersey to get the goods of the Garden State, the provisions that, I don't know, it's winter, people have stockpiled things. And so the British are sending foragers out also to gather livestock. And what happens during this time is Washington, as well as now the New Jersey militia, will send out parties to attack them. And it's this forage war during the winter months of 1777, winter and early spring of 1777, actually kill more British troops than the battles at Princeton or Trenton. This is a much bigger loss. It's a steady loss as they're sending out foraging parties who get attacked. Now, they will occasionally try to send out a fuller military force with the hopes they can engage Washington's army, knowing that when they do that, they probably can beat Washington. But Washington now is too savvy to engage them in a direct fight. So instead, it's these foraging parties that become targets for the Americans during this New Jersey campaign. So this is what's going on in New Jersey in the spring of 1777. And meanwhile, there are a couple of other big events really important to the whole history of the war. So sadly, we're now going to have to leave New Jersey for a bit to talk about other theaters of the war. And so we will, though, come back to New Jersey, I believe, eventually. Yeah, we do have some more things to do in New Jersey. Here's a trivia question for you. Well, I wouldn't ask this one. The dean's told me to stop talking about myself. Can anyone guess where Professor Allison spent the first 12 years of his life?
Was it New Jersey?
It was New Jersey, Sean. Thank you. Yes. But this isn't why I'm telling you all about New Jersey. And I'm sure your other professors spend time telling you about wherever it was they once spent time. But no, New Jersey actually is very important in the history of the war. So two other big things happening. One, and both actually involve, we have to turn our attention now to Europe. General Burgoyne, remember, he had been in and around Boston, and he went back to England after the fall of Boston, after the evacuation of Boston. And he goes back to England with a big idea. And Burgoyne is one of these great characters. His father had been an army captain, and when young John Burgoyne was 15 years old, his father purchased his son a commission in the Horse Guards, and he became a regimental commander. And he was involved in some of the campaigns in Portugal in the 1760s. And his real passion, though, was writing plays. He was a dramatist, and he wrote a number of successful plays. One of them, The Maid of Oaks, was performed on Drury Lane in 1775, same time he's being shipped off to join the fight in North America. And so he's part of this. As he said, he was the third wheel or the fifth wheel on the Boston coach, because you already had Gage, you had Howe, you had Clinton. And so he's, really not necessary there. So think about this, playwright. In fact, the British soldiers did put on plays in Faneuil Hall. And in fact, they had a character who was Washington in these, a guy with big wooden teeth and a big sword, and kind of a ridiculous character, probably the last time Washington was played for comic relief. And he goes back, so Burgoyne thinks the whole war is going wrong for us. What we really need to do is something different. So he goes back to London with an idea. And here it is. How about, he suggests, and he is someone who has enough connections that he can go talk to someone like the Ministry of, at the Department of War, and say, here's what we should do. Send me with an army to Quebec, and what I will do is take, say, 10,000 men down Lake Champlain, and meanwhile, whoever is holding New York, and we think it's Howe at this time, will come up the river, will join us there, and that will cut off New England. Meanwhile, we'll send another force this way, up the Mohawk River. They'll join up with the native people in the Mohawk River Valley, and the Mohawk, the Iroquois Confederation was remaining neutral in the war. The 6 nations now of the Iroquois were remaining neutral. The Mohawk always had been more supportive of the British, the English, than the French, and there's a chance they'll probably join us. One of the leading Mohawk warriors was Joseph Brant. So there's some thinking, maybe we can cooperate with the Indians here. And this would really cut off New England, take New York, and plus give us access to the interior. This would be a masterstroke that Burgoyne proposes. So he is given this command in the late 1776. This plan is being hatched, and in early 1777, Burgoyne actually is on his way. He's back in Quebec actually in May of 1777. Now, there are a couple of major problems with this whole plan. The big one is, on paper, it looks great. But if you don't know this terrain, it's a lot different if you're there. I mean, here it looks relatively easy, but imagine if you've ever been on the shores of Lake Champlain or in these mountains in what then were called the New Hampshire Grants, or in these mountains here, though these are the Green Mountains, these are the Adirondacks or the White Mountains, and I believe that the White Mountains, someone will correct me if I am wrong. I know there are White Mountains in New Hampshire as well, so I apologize for mixing up the geography of New Hampshire. Having spent too much time thinking about the geography of Western New Jersey, now it's difficult for me to get back to New England, but it's different here. You have these huge forests, no roads, and no real supplies for this army of 10,000 men that's supposed to come down Lake Champlain, or as Horace Walpole, who was a guy, kind of a London man about town who keeps a diary, and he usually has really nasty comments to make about people. He says, Burgoyne has said he can cross the continent with a hop, skip, and a jump. It's much different if you're actually on this continent. That's one problem with it. Second problem with it is the Governor General of Canada is a guy named Sir Guy Carleton. I think I mentioned he was the reason the American campaign in Canada had not gone well. And Carleton had proposed a very similar thing the previous year. Give me more men and I'll invade down Lake Champlain. And they had said no. And now they have Burgoyne coming with 10,000 men, and Carleton is told to cooperate with him. Carleton thinks this is ridiculous. Why didn't you give me 10,000 men? And I would have done it. I already know the terrain. But no, Carleton is just told cooperate with Burgoyne. I think you can imagine that Carleton's cooperation isn't going to be as keen as it might be. And here is another problem. It was really critical to this, that as Burgoyne is moving down the river, the Howes are moving up the river, but apparently no one had ever bothered to tell the Howes that. So as Burgoyne is up here in Quebec, making plans to come down Lake Champlain, the Howe brothers, the admiral and the general, who are now in charge of things, have decided to carry their campaign somewhere else. They sail out of New York, huge fleet sails from New York, and no one actually knows where it's going. In fact, they're gone. The 266 ships leave New York carrying the Howes with them. And actually, Horace Walpole says they've carried the American war with them, because no one knows where these thousands of men are going. Washington doesn't. Burgoyne doesn't even know they're gone. General Clinton is in he had been in Newport, and one reason Clinton was in Newport is he absolutely despised the Howes. But now that the Howes have left New York, he goes back to New York, but still doesn't know Burgoyne is trying to come down the river. So this is the state of things here, as Howe, with 17,000 men, has left New York at the same time as Burgoyne, with 10,000 men, is coming down the river. So there's a big lesson in this for all of you about planning, communication, and so on, more so than the lesson of what actually happened to Burgoyne and his army. We're learning this for the moral lessons. Now, the other big thing happening here involves France. France, you'll recall, traditional foe of the British, and defeated in 1763. And now, as this war is beginning with the British colonies in North America, some French officers see an opportunity to get on with their careers and do something more interesting than simply doing garrison duty in the West Indies or hanging around in France. And you also have the Americans recognizing that if they do require a lot of military supplies, and they have to get them from somewhere, and France seems a likely place. Now, the problem here is France is neutral. France cannot take sides in this war because that will bring the British into a war against them. And the last war they had against Britain didn't go very well for the French. So there is an American agent in Paris named Silas Deane. And Silas Deane was a guy from Connecticut. He had been he was a merchant, and he's off in France. And Deane recognizes that the Americans do need stuff. The French have stuff, but the French cannot actually send anything officially or even unofficially. If there is a French company sending ammunition to the Americans, the British will get wind of it and will raise all kinds of trouble for the French. So what Deane does is he gets together with a French playwright. Now, for those of you interested in theater, okay, so now I have mentioned two playwrights who were involved in this, who play critical roles in the war. And the Frenchman is a guy named Beaumarchais. And Beaumarchais is probably, anyone know what Beaumarchais' best known work was in terms of being a playwright, not in terms of setting up a dummy corporation to send goods to the Americans? He wrote a play which actually Mozart set to music and made into an opera. That's quite an accomplishment, isn't it? That would be the equivalent, I suppose, of having Lin-Manuel Miranda set something of yours to music. I keep sending him tapes of my lectures, but nothing doing yet. I've even tried to, I'm actually trying to write my current book in rap, but that's probably why it's slow going.
Give us a hint.
Okay, it involves an Italian barber. He might have been, yeah, and he gets married.
No idea.
I don't blame you. I blame your teachers, parents, and culture in general for not letting you know about the marriage of Figaro. I see Jordan saying, oh, the marriage of Figaro. Yes, I was about to start humming a few bars of it. Yes, so, okay. So Beaumarchais, Marriage of Figaro, light French farce, very popular in its day. And now he and Silas Deane set up a dummy corporation operating partially through France, partially through Spain to ship stuff to the Americans. And in fact, in early 1770, they sent something like enough ammunition and guns for 22,000 men to the Americans. And this is when the French are officially neutral. Of course, it's going to be big trouble for the French if the British find out about this, which is why it has to be kept strictly secret. Now, another thing happening in all of this is French officers think this would be a good way for me to actually fight the English, which is what I want to do. And here you have these Americans who've started an army. Clearly what they need are trained officers. So you do have a good number, of French officers who arrive in America. They've gone to Silas Deane, and Silas Deane has written them a little pass saying, yeah, you can go to America. And they present themselves to Congress, and Congress recognizes we want to have France on our side, and we really can't tell these officers to go home. The officers generally come with a retinue of servants and staff and other things. And of course, they want to be paid for their trouble, because it's not an insignificant thing. If you've ever tried to bring a staff and servants across the ocean to go fight in a war, it's an expensive undertaking. And these are real serious officers. There are a couple of problems with them. One is they don't speak English. And another is, by this time, there are American officers who say, well, wait a minute, how come suddenly this French general is giving me orders, which I can't understand? So Congress says, well, we need these French officers because they're bringing this extra dimension to the war, and ultimately we want the support of France. And Washington has to keep trying to counsel Congress. At one point, Washington says to Congress, don't send any more officers who can't speak English. Now, every French officer who does speak English takes that as an invitation. They want French officers who can speak English. And one of the ones who causes the most trouble is General Ducoudray. And General Ducoudray was a real French officer. Washington also said, you know, we really need engineers. So if they have any officers who are engineers, send them. That is, people who know how to design forts and things like that. You know, but the cavalry officers, we really don't need. And artillery officers, we don't need. We've got artillery officers, we've got cavalry officers, we've got infantry officers. We need engineers. And Monsieur Ducoudray wasn't really an engineer, but he is of high enough rank and persistent enough personality, Congress is kind of afraid of him. And I don't know if you've ever dealt with a French officer or an officer of any kind. I mean, it can be very intimidating. If you're, you know, the members of Congress tend to be lawyers and so on, and kind of some of them are easily intimidated. And Monsieur Ducoudray, Washington, by the way, is not easily intimidated. And he tells Congress, we don't need Monsieur Ducoudray. And Congress says, well, we have to find something for him to do. And they create a position for him of Inspector General. And when he is told he is the only Inspector General, he reports directly to Congress, he thinks, well, that's really a very good thing. And then when he starts inquiring further, what are the duties of the Inspector General? He finds out he doesn't have any duties. So he realizes he's just been kind of shunted aside, and he gets quite angry. So he goes down to Congress to tell them what's what. And as you're probably aware, Philadelphia sits between the Delaware River and the Schuylkill River. And so to approach from the west, you need to cross the Schuylkill River, and there's a ferry over the Schuylkill River. And Monsieur Ducoudray rides on to the ferry, and the ferry boat operator tells him, you'd better get off your horse before the ferry starts to move. Well, if you are a French officer, you belong on your horse. And if you're a French officer, you do not take orders from boatmen. So he tells the man to move, keep moving. And Monsieur Ducoudray, sitting upon his horse, the ferry begins to move. The horse gets spooked, dives off of the boat, and drowns Monsieur Ducoudray. Sadly, the horse also drowns. Another European officer who arrived on the scene at this time says that Monsieur Ducoudray spared the Congress much trouble by drowning, which he did. The other European officer is a Baron de Kalb from Germany, and he had arrived in July of 1777 along with the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, Lafayette's story is a bit different. We'll get to Lafayette in a bit, but first I want to tell you about someone else who goes to France at the end of 1776, and that is Benjamin Franklin. You know, Silas Deane had been off in France trying to keep things together, arranging this dummy corporation, and the Americans recognize if they really want to bring France into an alliance, they need to send heavier artillery to make the case to France. And that person is Benjamin Franklin, now 70 years old and in bad health. In fact, he suffers from gout and kidney stones. And he has been around a long time. And so in December of 1776, he and his two grandsons, Temple Franklin, who is the son, you know, Dylan tells us that gout is the worst, and Temple Franklin was the illegitimate son of Franklin's illegitimate son, William, the former governor of New Jersey. Benjamin Franklin and his son, William, had become estranged, and as part of the big battle going on between William Franklin and Benjamin Franklin snatches away Temple Franklin so he will be properly raised and won't become a Tory. And the other grandson is Benjamin Franklin Bache, the son of Benjamin Franklin's daughter, Sarah. She had married, against Franklin's wishes, a man named Bache, Richard Bache, who was a merchant, and kind of as a way of appeasing her irate father, not happy with the marriage, they had the good sense to name their firstborn Benjamin Franklin Bache. And Benjamin Franklin Bache is about 7 years old. Temple is a teenager at this time. And when these two boys arrive, Temple Franklin, a teenager, becomes Franklin's secretary. And Benjamin Franklin Bache is put to work in a printing shop in Paris. And he becomes a printer and later on will become publisher of a newspaper in Philadelphia. Anyway, Franklin, though, is a famous person. He is well known. He's already well known in France. He's already been to France. And it was his experiments with electricity in the 1750s that had made him into an international celebrity. In fact, the court scientist for King Louis XV had set up an apparatus to try to test out Franklin's theory on whether lightning and electricity were the same thing. And this was before Franklin had tested this out by flying a kite. You have someone in Paris trying out Franklin's experiment. He was well known among the scientific community in France, and Franklin's arrival in France in December of 1776 is a sensation because to the French, he represents this new world. Unlike people in the French court, he doesn't wear an elaborate wig. Instead, remember, it's December. He's just crossed the ocean and he's wearing a fur hat made of marten fur, very warm hat, but he dresses simply and he seems to represent the new world to the French, the great philosopher who is now, in fact, Turgot, a French philosophe, coins a motto for Franklin in Latin. If you wanted anything to last in the 18th century, you would write it in Latin. And the motto, you can see it inscribed in the back of the Franklin statue in front of the old City Hall in Boston. And I am about to start asking those of you who've been in previous classes with me, and we've done the walk to Franklin's statue, we've paid homage at that shrine, what the slogan is. Eripuit celo fulmen sceptrumque tyrannus. I'll try to type it in. Did you know that once upon a time an admissions exam to get into college was being able to read Latin? That was the theory I was operating on when I posed that for this particular question.
Professor, where did you type it?
Oh, it's on the chat. I'm sorry, it's in the chat.
Oh, I didn't get it.
Yeah, I can't see anything either.
My apologies. Let me see. I'll try it again. Can you see it now?
Yeah, got it. And what did you say this month?
I was asking you.
Oh, I have no idea.
Okay. Jillian says, yeah, as though she agrees with it.
I just Googled it.
Oh, good, Sean. What does it say?
It means he snatched the lightning shaft from heaven and the scepter from tyrants.
That's very good. Okay. He snatched the lightning from the heaven. That's the Franklin was showing that lightning is electricity, and therefore it's something that can be controlled. And he is seizing the scepter from the tyrants. And French women would decorate their, ladies of the French court like to wear these elaborate headdresses. And there's one party where one of these ladies of the French court went with a frigate on the top of her head. But this banner is everywhere in France. And by the way, you could buy medallions with a picture of Franklin, little figurines of Franklin, images of Franklin. Franklin wrote to his daughter that his face was more familiar in France than the man in the moon. And this appears everywhere. By the way, King Louis XVI isn't really keen on people snatching scepters from tyrants. There is one lady of the French court that the king thinks is overly fond of Dr. Franklin. And so he has a chamber pot made for her with Franklin's picture at the bottom and this motto around it. So you have this, Franklin really taking France by storm, that is becoming this figure. And probably one of the most dramatic moments happens in 1778 when Voltaire returns to Paris. Voltaire, France's greatest man of letters, had been in exile in Geneva, and he comes back to Paris essentially to die. And he's only in Paris for about 6 weeks before he does go to his great reward. But in that time, he meets with Benjamin Franklin 3 times. And the first time is actually when Franklin and his grandson Temple go to call on Voltaire. And Voltaire is lying in bed, surrounded by other people who adore Voltaire, France's greatest living writer, possibly France's greatest man of letters of all time. And Voltaire and Franklin immediately begin speaking to each other as though they are old friends, and they are speaking in English. And all of Voltaire's friends say, after a few minutes in French, "Could you please speak French so we can understand you?" And Voltaire says, "Yes, my dears, but you understand, I have the vanity to show I can speak the language of a Franklin." And then Franklin asks if Voltaire will bless his grandson. Imagine this. Voltaire is, well, I think an atheist with a capital A, but he's asked to bless this teenage grandson of Benjamin Franklin. And he places his hands on Temple Franklin's head and says, "God and liberty." And he writes to a friend later, "What else could one say for the grandson of a Franklin?" And then the two meet at the French Academy. And this is one of these cosmic events in the history of the world when Voltaire and Franklin are there in public. For many of the people in the audience, it's the first time they have seen Voltaire, who's been in exile for 30 years. By the way, Voltaire also was something of a natural philosopher. In fact, the reason we know the story about Isaac Newton seeing an apple fall is because Voltaire visited Newton's estate a few weeks after Newton's death, and Newton's niece told him about it. And Voltaire wrote a biography of Newton in which that story figures. I know a number of our physics professors have tried to explain Newton's theories to me. I can't make head nor tail of them, but I know how an apple falls, and that shows that there is gravity. So Voltaire and Franklin, and the two of them are seated on a raised platform opposite each other, and the crowd wants them to acknowledge one another. And so the two men get up and bow to each other, but the crowd wants something more. They want to see more of a demonstration of a connection between these two. And so these two old men approach each other and shake hands. the crowd is getting more worked up with this. And then, but this still is not enough. They say, you must embrace in the French manner. Il faut embrasser à la française. And so these two old men hug each other and kiss each other on the cheeks. And the crowd is delirious. And someone says, how charming it is to see Solon and Sophocles embracing. Solon, the ancient Greek lawgiver, and Sophocles, the ancient Greek playwright. This is a moment when the French Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, and the American Enlightenment seem to join in Paris. And it seems like an electric shock goes through all of Europe and all the world. It seems, as Thomas Paine had said, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. And that's really what you see with Franklin's arrival in France and his ability not only to charm the French, but to advance these ideas of the Enlightenment in France and in America. So this is what's going on. And meanwhile, a young French aristocrat named the Marquis de Lafayette, 17 years old, he's decided to go to America. And Lafayette visited London in early 1777 actually he'd already decided to go to America. Lafayette was an orphan. His uncle was the French minister to England. So he visits London not as a common tourist, but as a well-known French aristocrat, fabulously wealthy. He also is married to a young woman, a teenager like him, and it's also somewhat unusual for marriages among French aristocrats that the two seem to be madly in love with each other and will remain faithful to each other throughout their lives. But young Lafayette visits London. The king invites him to come and see the British armaments, the British fleet building at Portsmouth. And Lafayette, already having decided he's going to go to America, thinks it would not be in good taste for him to take up the king's invitation. He goes back to France and meets with Silas Deane. He meets with Benjamin Franklin. He wants to go to America. And Franklin and Deane tell him, well, you know, that would be nice, but they're really full up with French officers. And Lafayette says, how about if I pay my own way? Do you think they'll allow me to come as a volunteer? We said, well, yeah, you could go as a volunteer. So Lafayette had purchased a yacht in England to take him to America. And he's outfitting this yacht when the British government informs the French government that if Lafayette leaves France, the British will take that as an act of war. So the King of France orders Lafayette's arrest, and Lafayette gets onto his yacht just ahead of an arrest by the King of France to stop him from reaching America. And so Lafayette, along with the Baron de Kalb, a German officer, set sail across the Atlantic, and they arrive in Charleston, South Carolina. And from there, Lafayette and de Kalb make their way up to Philadelphia so he can present himself to Congress. Franklin had written to them saying, Lafayette is coming. This is really a big deal. They hadn't gotten that notice yet. So when Lafayette knocks on the door of the Congress, speaking in French, they send into Congress for John Lovell, who is a member of Congress who happens to speak French. He had taught at the Boston Latin School. And he comes out and tells Lafayette, we really don't need any more French officers. Lafayette's stunned. He's escaped from France. He's paid his own way. He's now walked from Charleston, South Carolina. And they tell him, go home. And he says, well, could I at least come in? And Lovell says, come back tomorrow at noon. We'll give you 5 minutes. So the next day at noon, Lafayette presents himself at Congress, and in the 5 minutes, he tells them about what he has done to come. And he says, having done this, I would only ask 2 favors, that I be allowed to serve as a volunteer and that I serve at my own expense. And come back next week and I'll tell you what Congress answered. So that's it. We'll see you next week. Have a good weekend. Carry on.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Good to see you
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.